Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 39, The Second Syrian War. Last time, we briefly examined the role of the Antigonids in the war against the Ptolemies. Today, we're going to turn our attention to the main section of the conflict, the fight between Ptolemy II and Antiochus II. We don't know a lot about the war, and the timing and flow of events varies. For example, Bevan wrote that the Second Syrian War is not as well documented as its predecessor. Now, different sources have offered different dates for when the war started and ended. I've seen start dates ranging from 261 or earlier to 258 BCE, and end dates from 255/253 to 250 BCE. The version I'm going with for the purpose of our narrative is that the war broke out in 259/258 and ended in about 253 BCE. In addition to this, some sources do not list the rebellion in Ephesus as the cause of the war, as we've done in our narrative, but instead unfolding as part of the conflict, which has already started. So, bear in mind that some points and dates may vary between sources. With that said, let's dive back into the conflict. As we've covered before, Ptolemy the Younger unsuccessfully rebelled against his father from Ephesus, with the last reference to him in the records coming in April/May of 259 BCE. However, there are slight variations on what happens next. Antiochus II may have provoked Ptolemy II into war through his capture of Miletus. Alternatively, both Antiochus II and the city of Rhodes may have taken the opportunity the chaos presented to declare war on Egypt, with overlapping claims in coastal Anatolia being the reason, particularly the ownership of Miletus and Ephesus. Moreover, revenge may have played a role. Antiochus II believed he was powerful enough to seek to undo the damage of his father's previous losses. The Seleucids had previously been unable to act in the Mediterranean due to strife within the kingdom. Looping back round to Ephesus, there's some disagreement between different sources about the ownership of the city relative to the war's timeline. It seems to have been transferred from the Seleucid kingdom to Egypt in either the late stages of the reign of Antiochus II or the early years of his son's rule. However, its recapture by the Seleucids was either before the war or in its early phases, by a joint expedition of a Rhodian fleet and Seleucid land forces. Either way, it managed to rebuff a Ptolemaic attempt to capture it, and inscriptions from 253 BCE show it to have been a Seleucid possession at this time. Now, let's take a moment to discuss Ephesus under Seleucid rule. The city would pass under direct royal control once Antiochus II got hold of it. However, the Ionian cities do appear to have held him in high regard. When the Romans arrive in the region a century from now, Antiochus II will still be referred to as a god, and the citizens will still be hearkening back to his decrees, as if he'd given them their freedom. Anyway, the Egyptian navy under Chromonides, who we discussed back in episode 35, would suffer a defeat close by Ephesus between 259 and 255 BCE. In addition, there's the defeat to Antigonus II in the Battle of Kos if it's placed in 255 BCE, as we discussed previously. In the early years of the war, Ptolemy II travelled north and invaded Seleucid possessions in Syria and Cilicia, shifting the war's focus away from its origin in western Anatolia. He may have been attempting to capitalise on internal problems within the Seleucid realm. Although the accession of Antiochus II in Syria had been smooth, at this time there was some sort of disturbance caused by a man named Seleucus. This new Seleucus was potentially an impostor claiming to be the elder son of Antiochus I. What we know about this is that someone called Seleucus who was not the young king caused trouble, and somebody was impaled to death, the usual punishment for treason. In addition, valuable items were stockpiled in the Babylonian palace, and there was trouble with the garrison of a fortress, likely in Babylon. It was a serious enough threat that Antiochus II had to return to Babylon to deal with the issue. As such, Ptolemy II may have been exploiting the combination of his enemy having to deal with the revolt in Babylon and disruption in Ephesus and Miletus. There may have been other reasons for this decision: the hostility of the usually pro-Ptolemaic Rhodes, the fact that the Ptolemaic navy in the Aegean wouldn't be much use against the land might of the Seleucids, and the little scope for taking Anatolian territory, as Antiochus I's building project may have paid off. Now, Ptolemy faced problems by striking into Syria. The settlements in the region were walled, prepared for conflict, and loyal to the Seleucid cause. As mentioned before, the succession of Antiochus II had been smooth there. Numismatic evidence attests to a Ptolemaic invasion in the region of Antioch and Seleucia Pieria in 259 or 258 BCE, but I've seen the incursion dated to 257 BCE in one source. There was also conflict in Cilicia, as evidenced by a buried hoard of treasure in Ptolemaic possessions in the region. Furthermore, the mint of Tarsus in Seleucid-controlled smooth Cilicia started producing Ptolemaic currency. Despite the capture of Tarsus, the campaign wasn't a successful one. The Ptolemies appear to have been ejected from Syria in 258 BCE, and from Cilicia and Tarsus shortly afterwards, being chased all the way back to the city of Calendaris. The campaign in Syria ended in 257 BCE. At this point, we're going to discuss the city of Abydos, the sole Phoenician settlement which was in Seleucid hands. Its maximum claim stretched over 70 kilometres of coast leading up to the Seleucid border with Egypt at the Eleutheros River. Importantly, its preeminence was in a vital region with two areas the Ptolemies could use as a launchpad into Syria. In 259 BCE, Abydos swapped the Seleucid calendar for a new city calendar beginning at year 1. This points to a new regime, and may have involved the local king being deposed and a government friendlier to the Seleucids being put in his place. This was enough to keep Abydos within the Seleucid sphere. Not that the war was just restricted to Syria, Anatolia would also see action. The fighting in Anatolia has been denoted as likely having been messy, as the Egyptian fleet was not as powerful as it had once been. The Seleucids had previously initiated an alliance with Alexandria Troas and Ilion, but this transitioned into virtual Seleucid control, with the danger posed by the Ptolemaic navy likely being the reason given. Moreover, Antiochus II recognised the fact that Ariarathes III, the ruler of Cappadocia, elevated himself to the position of king in 255 BCE, although this is only one version of how this came to pass. He probably did so after winning a victory against the Galatians. The idea of connecting elevation to military success was a common one, but such triumphs were not something Ariarathes' family had indulged in, despite having been present in Cappadocia in some capacity since the days of the Achaemenid Persians. This rise in rank may also have come about by means of successful negotiations with the Seleucids. Any victory against the Galatians was a good thing for Antiochus II, while Ariarathes himself was not a threat. As we'll discuss more in a future episode, Antiochus also set up a marriage with the Seleucid princess for Ariarathes. Alternatively, the marriage may even have prompted the elevation in order to ensure Ariarathes was a suitably eligible match. Seleucid Cappadocia, conquered by Antiochus's grandfather from the Antigonids decades earlier, may have exchanged hands as a wedding present or a dowry. Cappadocia was subsequently within the Seleucid sphere. We'll discuss all of this in more detail in a future episode. Not that the picture in Anatolia overall was exclusively a Seleucid success story. In 264 BCE, the city of Nicomedia had been founded in Bithynia, and the population of Astarchos moved into it. Its foundation increased Bithynia's capacity to defend itself, in the style of the Seleucid city-building policy in Syria and Anatolia. In addition, Eumenes founded the cities of Philetaria and Attaleia, and settled some troublesome hired mercenaries there in order to mollify them. Philetaria is thought to have been east of Mount Ida, while Anatolia was situated in such a way as to be able to cut off travel between the north and the south, which Antiochus II had previously attempted to secure by founding the city of Stratonicaea. Eumenes also seized the port town of Elaia, which had the potential to become a significant military harbour. By using the distraction of the great powers, Eumenes was able to expand and consolidate his domains. Although we can't go into too much detail on Anatolia's kingdoms here, there is one more development worth noting today. In approximately 255 BCE, Nicomedes I of Bithynia died. This triggered a succession crisis. Nicomedes had named the children by his second marriage to a woman called Zeta as his heirs, which his son Zaealus by his first marriage objected to. Zaealus had previously fled Bithynia and was living in Armenia when his father died. His father's will left Zeta's sons in charge, under the protection of several major and minor powers. Zaealus enlisted the help of the Tlistobogai and invaded, triggering a civil conflict against Zeta's supporters, who were backed militarily by the states protecting her children. Now, this needs some explaining, as I haven't mentioned the name Tlistobogai before. I've previously referred to Galatia and the Gauls as a single unit, but in point of fact they were split into 3 tribes. The easternmost group, with their centre at Tavium, were the Trochmai. Likely bordering them at the Halys River were the Tactosarges, with their capital at Ancyra. Closest to Bithynia were the Tlistobogai, hence Zaealus turning to them. One version of the story holds that Zaealus was ultimately made king, but that this was due to the diplomatic efforts of Heraclea Pontique rather than military force. As a result, the Tlistobogai did not get the promised loot, which they saw as Heraclea's fault and accordingly raided its land. An alternative telling holds that the raid was a coordinated punishment by Zaealus for opposing him after he successfully conquered Bithynia. Zeta's eldest son Sepoites seems to turn up exiled in Macedon after this point. The overall picture is that Antiochus II did well during the Second Syrian War. The Ptolemaic attack on Syria was repelled and he'd done well over in the Aegean. One of my sources mentioned that the Seleucid conquest of Ephesus, Miletus and Samos was finished by 254/253 BCE. In addition, he'd worked against Ptolemy II diplomatically, creating an ally in Cappadocia, presumably persuading Rhodes to fight for him, and allowing the Gauls to intervene in Bithynia, thus preventing them from causing him problems. That said, Antiochus's focus on Western affairs had meant that the East had been neglected, with issues not being dealt with and rule being delegated. However, a discussion of the East will have to wait for a future episode. Now, the war didn't go well for Egypt. In contrast to other powers, Egypt maintained a standing army and navy largely comprised of hired mercenaries. Its unique large navy, with perhaps an effective size of 400 vessels, was used for the purposes of controlling the Ptolemaic Empire. In addition, armies were ready to defend Ptolemaic Syria and also present in the Cypriot and Aegean fleets. By contrast, Antigonus II had a much smaller army and navy of Macedonian citizens which was only present in wartime, while Antiochus II didn't really have a navy at all. His father had had some ships left over from Lysimachus, but by 260 BCE the majority of them were approaching the end of the normally 25-year life expectancy. Now, Egyptian finances appear to have been on the point of collapse only a few years into the war. In 258 BCE, an investigation was started up in order to find new ways to tax the already heavily taxed population. This probably worked, but it wouldn't have been a long-term solution. In addition, Egypt had failed to marry Berenike II to the Egyptian heir due to the intervention of Apama, as discussed in episode 38. Equally, the Seleucids had their share of difficulties. In 255 BCE, records mention that an unknown individual arrived in Babylon. At the same time, a large conflict took place in the walled region of Eridu in the heart of the city, across from Isangil, which refers to the temple of Bel Marduk. The reason for this violence has been attributed to the pressures of the war. Regardless of whether or not this is connected to the arrival of the unnamed figure into the city, it would have required Antiochus II's attention. By the late 250s, the war wound down. Both kings had taken comparatively little territory in their respective incursions. Ptolemy II had managed to entice Antigonus II to sign a separate peace with Egypt in 255 BCE. Eventually, potentially at Ptolemy's instigation, peace was signed with the Seleucids as well. Alternatively, both the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were looking for a way out by 255 or possibly earlier still. Ptolemy II was having the aforementioned financial issues, while Babylon was clearly in turmoil. In addition, there was an anomalous situation in the eastern satrapies, which we'll get into in a future episode. However, talks were strung out by the fact that neither Antiochus II nor Ptolemy II could own up to the fact that they were looking for a settlement. As such, this settlement would have to wait until 253 BCE. From a Seleucid point of view, the deal was a success. Whatever the Seleucids had lost to Ptolemy under Antiochus I was regained by Antiochus II. Cilicia and Pamphylia are given as possessions of Ptolemy II by Theocritus, as we saw when we covered the First Syrian War, but are not mentioned as part of Ptolemy III's inheritance further down the line. That said, no land beyond the Eleutheros River was surrendered. For those who don't remember, the Eleutheros River was established as the boundary between Seleucus I and Ptolemy I in the wake of the Battle of Ipsus almost 50 years earlier. This peace has been noted as a diplomatic victory for Ptolemy II, and different sources list the war as having ended between 255/253 and 250 BCE. However, as I mentioned at the start of the episode, I'm going to go with 253 BCE as the year when the deal was brokered between Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty. An alliance was formed in the wake of the treaty, and this arrangement was sealed by a marriage between the two families, accompanied by a large dowry payment. However, as it's going to become relevant later on in Antiochus II's story, I'm going to hold off talking about it for now. With the war with the Seleucids concluded, Ptolemy II was able to focus on other areas, as we've seen with peace arrangements in previous years and decades. While the Antigonids were bogged down fighting in Greece, Ptolemy II was able to assert himself once again in the Aegean, avenging the losses of the Cremonidean War. He also married his son, the future Ptolemy III, to the future Berenike II. So, that's the Second Syrian War done. However, we're not yet finished with conflict in the eastern Mediterranean during Antiochus II's reign. There's another conflict which Bevan wrote couldn't be linked to other events of the time, nor could the two pieces of evidence he discussed be connected to one another due to the lack of sources. Specifically, we need to discuss Antiochus's involvement in mainland Europe. So, next time, we'll be heading back to the lands of Thrace, which have last been involved with Seleucid affairs after the death of Seleucus I in 261. Until then, thank you for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.